Usually when we talk about a major historical expedition, there's this ingrained expectation of just like pure majesty.
Right, yeah. The classic heroic narrative.
Exactly. It's like looking at one of those grand 19th century oil paintings.
Oh, absolutely.
You picture the bold explorers standing on a mountain peak. There's a crisp, clean wind blowing their hair, and they're pointing decisively toward the horizon.
Usually holding a perfectly rolled map, right?
Yes, a perfectly rolled map. It just feels triumphant. It feels like the ultimate conquest of nature, executed by these just unshakable heroes.
And I mean, it is a deeply comforting image. We are really conditioned to imagine history as this steady upward march of progress.
Yeah, like sheer willpower just effortlessly overcomes the elements.
But the reality of exploration is fundamentally incompatible with that painting.
It really is.
When you actually peel back the mythology and examine the granular realities of human biology colliding with a truly hostile environment.
The painting shatters.
Exactly, that pristine image just completely shatters.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
This is part 3 of 4 of our chronological deep dive into the source material on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And for you listening, today's mission is to examine the brutal fall of 1805 through the just utterly miserable winter of 1805 into 1806.
Which is arguably the darkest phase of the entire journey.
Oh, without a doubt. And to do this, we are pulling from a massive stack of materials. We aren't just looking at the original daily journals penned by the captains.
Right, because those only tell one side of the story.
Yeah. We are layering those with modern medical retrodiagnoses, meteorological data, geographic overlays, and crucially, indigenous oral histories.
Because we want to know not just what happened, but exactly how and why they survived.
Exactly. So, what is the overarching theme for this specific leg of the journey?
Well, the theme here is stark, violent transition. Up until this point, if you remember from our previous discussions, the expedition had been moving through vast open plains. And they were navigating ecosystems that, while challenging, were relatively abundant in game. And they offered somewhat predictable river travel.
But that completely changes now.
It does. As we transition into this period, they crash headfirst into horrific physical barriers. They face near starvation.
Like literal starvation.
Yes. And they are forced into these highly complex, incredibly tense economic interactions with the sophisticated tribes of the Pacific coast.
I mean, if you thought their journey across the plains was tough, wait until you hear what the mountains and the rain did to them. We are talking about wild, unimaginable contrast today.
Oh, absolutely.
You are going to hear about a frail, elderly woman who single-handedly saves this elite, heavily armed military unit from total annihilation.
Such an incredible story.
Right. And we're going to unpack a famous quote of pure, historic joy that actually serves as a prelude to a week of sheer terror dodging 200-foot-long logs in freezing water.
That part is just mind-blowing.
And we'll examine a historic democratic vote that included an enslaved man and an indigenous woman, happening decades before the laws of the United States would ever dream of recognizing their voices.
And throughout all of this, we really need to connect the extreme physical suffering of these individuals to their psychological coping mechanisms.
Yeah, how they mentally survived it.
Right. The central question for this part of the journey is, how does the human mind endure when the body is quite literally starving, freezing, and rotting away in the damp cold?
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand how desperate things got, we have to start at the most punishing physical obstacle of the entire transcontinental mission.
The Bitterroot Mountains.
Exactly. It's September 1805, and the core of Discovery hits the Bitterroots.
And they're attempting to traverse the Lolo Trail. Now, you have to understand, this isn't a gentle, winding mountain pass that you might picture driving through today.
Right, it's not like a scenic highway.
Not at all. The Bitterroots are categorized by incredibly steep, trackless, razor-sharp ridges.
And didn't the weather just immediately turn on them?
Oh, terribly. The expedition hit these mountains right as premature winter storms decided to roll in, which completely altered the terrain.
I was reading the daily journals from this week, and it feels less like a record of exploration and more like, I don't know, a slow-motion disaster unfolding.
Yeah, a survival horror story almost.
Totally. They are pushing through blinding snow and plunging temperatures, and the physical toll on the animals, it is just agonizing to read about.
The terrain is so precipitous that their pack horses are simply losing their footing.
Yeah, they're literally tumbling down these rocky embankments, smashing into trees and boulders.
Which, if you think about it, creates a catastrophic logistical cascade for a military expedition.
Because they lose everything on the horse.
Exactly. When a pack horse rolls down a mountain, you don't just lose the animal's carrying capacity, you lose the vital equipment strapped to its back.
I read that William Clark's portable writing desk and his personal trunk were completely obliterated in one of these falls.
They were smashed to pieces. And the caloric expenditure required for the men to just, climb down those ravines, retrieve the surviving gear, and haul it back up to the trail in freezing conditions. It's immense.
And they don't have the calories to spend.
No, they don't.
Because here is the truly terrifying part.
Yeah.
As they push higher into these altitudes, traditional game animals vanish entirely.
Ton.
There are no deer, no elk, there is nothing to shoot. They hit an acute, absolute crisis of subsistence. I mean, they are starving.
Starving to the point of desperation.
Yeah. On September 14th, near the Clearwater River, the situation is so dire that they are forced to slaughter and eat a young, healthy horse.
Right. They literally named the site Colt Killed Creek in their records.
Which is so grim.
It is. Eating a pack animal is the ultimate red flag in expeditionary travel. It highlights the complete collapse of their primary logistics.
Because you're eating your ride home.
Precisely. You are consuming your transportation to fuel your body for just a few more days.
And it didn't even last.
Yeah.
By September 16th, that horse meat is either gone or they feel they just cannot afford to kill another healthy animal yet.
So they have to resort to their absolute emergency rations.
Right. The stuff called portable soup.
Yes, the portable soup.
I went down a complete rabbit hole on this portable soup, and it is completely fascinating and honestly revolting.
It's pretty gnarly.
Yeah. This wasn't some nice dehydrated vegetable broth. They purchased this stuff all the way back in Philadelphia.
Which they had been carrying for over a year.
Right. And it was essentially veal cartilage and cow hooves that had been boiled down for days until it formed a thick gelatinous glue.
And then dried into hard, rock-solid pucks.
I mean, cow hooves. It's basically glue.
It was a technology heavily utilized by the British Royal Navy at the time. The idea was to create a source of dense, non-perishable protein.
But the preparation in this specific environment is what makes it so grim.
Oh, definitely.
Picture this. You are listening to this right now. Put yourself there. You are huddled on a frozen ridge, thousands of miles from home. The wind is howling. You are freezing to death.
Right.
And you are desperately trying to melt enough snow over a sputtering wet fire just to rehydrate these rock-hard glue blocks of cow hoof that you've carried across a continent.
And the taste was reportedly abysmal.
It must have felt like eating the ghost of a meal.
That's a great way to put it. Think about what that portable soup represents psychologically, though.
What do you mean?
Well, it is the absolute last fading tether to the East Coast scientific and industrial establishment.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It is civilized, industrialized provision being consumed in the most untamed, hostile environment imaginable. It's a physical manifestation of their desperation.
And I'm guessing it didn't even really help that much.
No, frankly, it provided nowhere near the caloric density required to sustain men doing that level of extreme physical labor in freezing temperatures.
And it wasn't enough. Because by September 18th, near a place they aptly named Hungry Creek, they are stumbling through steep falling timber.
Just completely exhausted.
And they find a stray horse wandering in a glade, and they immediately slaughter it just to stay alive. The men are physically breaking down.
They are. Yet, amid this total physical collapse, we see something deeply revealing about leadership and human psychology.
This part blew my mind.
While the men are starving and desperately butchering a stray horse, Meriwether Lewis is sitting down to record incredibly detailed, systematic observations of previously undocumented bird species.
Right.
He is taking meticulous scientific notes on the Steller's jay and several varieties of western grouse.
I kept rereading that part because it feels so incongruous.
It really does.
It's like sitting down to do a highly complex Sudoku puzzle while your house is actively on fire.
That's a perfect analogy.
How do you just casually document the plumage of a new species of grouse when your men are literally eating horses to survive?
It requires a profound level of compartmentalization. But if we analyze this, cognitively structured intellectual activity often acts as a coping mechanism against overwhelming environmental hostility.
Like keeping your brain busy so you don't freak out.
Exactly. What happens to a military chain of command when the fundamental need for calories completely fails?
I mean, I get hangry when I miss lunch. I can't imagine this.
That's right. If the leader surrenders to the panic of the starving animal within, the entire social structure of the expedition collapses.
So by forcing his brain to focus on the exact wingspan of a bird, he's tricking himself out of the panic.
Precisely. By maintaining his role as the detached, observant scientist, Lewis is asserting a form of intellectual control over an environment where he has absolutely no physical control.
Wow, that's deep.
It keeps the leadership anchored. He is projecting a message to himself and, by extension, to his men. We are still explorers. We still have a mission. We are not just dying mammals in the snow.
That makes so much sense. It's a defense mechanism, not just a scientific endeavor.
Exactly.
But the mountains nearly killed them anyway. As they finally stagger out of the Bitterroots and descend onto the Whiteby Prairie, this is mid to late September, the real threat suddenly shifts.
Right, because they emerge from the mountains stripped of their physical strength and their military advantage.
Placing them entirely at the mercy of the people who already live there.
Yes. They survived the environment of the Lolo Trail, but they exit the mountains completely incapacitated. They are emaciated, weak, and vulnerable.
And this is the precise moment they encounter the Nimiipuu, commonly known as the Nez Perce Nation.
And the geopolitical situation that unfolds here is dripping with tension.
You really have to put yourself in the shoes of the Nez Perce warriors here.
Oh, absolutely.
They're looking at this group of strange, filthy men stumbling out of the mountains, and these strangers are carrying a massive, unprecedented cache of firearms, gunpowder, and highly valuable trade goods.
Right.
But they are so physically depleted they can barely walk, let alone mount a coordinated military defense.
The tactical calculus for the Nez Perce warriors was brutally straightforward.
Like, why wouldn't you take their stuff?
Exactly. Here is an immense source of wealth and regional military power, essentially unprotected.
Just sitting there.
Yes. The initial political consensus among several influential warriors was to execute the explorers and seize their assets.
Wow.
From a defensive, opportunistic standpoint, it was a completely logical move. Why allow an unknown, heavily armed force into your territory when you can neutralize them effortlessly?
And they were going to do it. The American Transcontinental Mission was about to end in a bloodbath right there in Idaho.
It really was.
But they are stopped, not by American diplomacy, not by a show of force, but by a frail, elderly Nez Perce woman named Watkuwais.
Watkuwais is arguably one of the most remarkable, unheralded figures in North American history.
Her story is wild.
Her name translates to returns from a far land, and her backstory is an epic saga of trauma and resilience that just defies comprehension.
The indigenous oral histories preserve her story, and it is mind-blowing.
It really is.
Years earlier, when she was young, she had been captured by the Hidatsa tribe during a raid.
And she was forcibly trafficked entirely across the continent to Canada.
She was traded and sold among various tribes all throughout the Great Lakes region.
The sheer terror of being torn from your homeland and trafficked across thousands of miles of unfamiliar territory, it's unimaginable.
But she survives it.
She does. She eventually ends up living among white communities, possibly French-Canadian fur traders. She even has a child.
But then tragedy strikes again.
Yes, her husband dies. But rather than remaining in captivity or dependence, she orchestrates her own escape.
Which is just incredible.
With the help of some friendly white settlers who provide her with crucial provisions and a horse, she embarks on a return journey to the Nez Perce.
I want everyone listening to just pause and think about the logistics of that. A 1,000-mile journey.
Alone.
Yes, across the 18th century North American interior. Back to the Nez Perce homeland.
It's an unbelievable feat.
So fast forward. She is sitting there in her camp as an elder when these starving Americans stumble in. And she hears the warriors planning their destruction.
And she intervened.
She stands before the tribal council and basically says, these are the white people. These are the people who showed me kindness and helped me during my captivity. Do not harm them.
The geopolitical butterfly effect of her life is staggering to contemplate.
Right, because if she hadn't been there...
If Watkuwais hadn't been kidnapped all those years earlier, if she hadn't endured that profound trauma, if she hadn't encountered that specific kindness from settlers in Canada, and if she hadn't possessed the immense fortitude to make a 1,000-mile escape back home.
The Lewis and Clark expedition is entirely wiped out in September 1805.
Exactly. The course of American Western expansion changes completely.
It completely flips the script on our cultural understanding of frontier survival.
It really does.
I mean, they spent months in Washington preparing for military defense, designing custom rifles, bringing all this gunpowder, drilling the men to be a lethal fighting force.
All that preparation.
And in the end, their ultimate shield, the only thing that kept them alive, was a grandmother saying, "Leave them alone, their people were nice to me once."
It's amazing. And what adds a layer of profound irony and highlights the limitations of the explorers' perspectives is the complete lack of awareness from the expedition's leadership.
Oh, this part makes me so mad.
William Clark actually notes in his daily journal that he saw this frail, elderly woman in the camp, but his entries reveal a total failure to comprehend her geopolitical significance.
He just logs her presence the way he logs a new species of pine tree.
Exactly.
He has absolutely no idea that she just vetoed their execution.
None whatsoever. But thanks to Wat Kuwis's moral authority, the Nez Perce shift instantly from opportunistic hostility to life-saving hospitality.
Which, paradoxically, triggers a brutal biological reaction that nearly kills the men anyway.
Because of the food.
Right. This brings us to late September, a grueling stretch they refer to as Canoe Camp.
So the Nez Perce, acting out of this newly established peaceful diplomacy, feed the starving men.
They offer them a feast of dried salmon, berries, and heavily cooked camas roots.
Now, the camas root was a vital staple for the Nez Perce. It is a highly nutritious, bulbous plant. But we have to look at the physiological reality of the explorers' bodies at this exact moment.
Right. These men have been starving. And for months before that, they were subsisting almost entirely on a pure protein diet of plains game, buffalo, deer, elk.
Their digestive tracts are primed for meat.
Hitting their stomachs with a sudden, massive influx of high-fiber, complex carbohydrates is the biological equivalent of dropping a bomb in their intestines.
Medical historians point to a specific carbohydrate in the camas root called inulin.
Inulin, okay.
The human body does not produce the enzymes necessary to break down inulin in the stomach or small intestine. It passes entirely intact into the large intestine, where it ferments.
Oh, no.
Yes, for a gut microbiome that is completely unaccustomed to it, this rapid fermentation produces massive amounts of gas, severe cramping, and osmotic diarrhea.
The journals describe it as devastating. The men experience violent bloating and extreme gastrointestinal distress.
It incapacitates almost the entire party, including both Lewis and Clark.
They are bedridden, sweating, and purging violently.
Imagine the vulnerability. The captains are laid out, unable to function or even stand, completely reliant on the very people who had debated slaughtering them just days prior.
Talk about being defenseless.
If the Nez Perce had harbored any lingering desire to eliminate them, the camas sickness made the Americans completely defenseless.
But instead, the Nez Perce pivot their hospitality to accommodate the fragile biology of these strangers.
Which is incredible.
Seeing that the men physically cannot digest the local roots without becoming violently ill, the chiefs offer them young, healthy horses to slaughter and eat.
They literally give up their own valuable mounts just so the Americans can have a protein source their bodies recognize.
It is a remarkable display of diplomatic generosity.
It really is.
And while the explorers are slowly recovering, they have to prepare for the next phase of the journey. From September 26th to October 7th, they establish a workspace near present-day Orofino, Idaho.
Because they need boats to navigate the river systems down to the ocean.
But remember, they are exhausted, they are recovering from violent GI distress, and the weather has turned sweltering hot.
And over 12 agonizing days, they have to carve 5 massive dugout canoes from gigantic ponderosa pine logs.
And they lack the physical energy to do it the way they traditionally would, by manually azzing out the wood.
So under the instruction of the Nez Perce, they utilize a controlled fire hollowing technique.
Okay, how exactly does that work? Because it sounds incredibly risky. If you were trying to make a boat, lighting the log on fire seems like a good way to end up with a pile of ash.
It does sound risky, but it requires immense patience and thermal control. Ponderosa pine is highly resinous. It burns very hot.
Right.
They would carefully place hot coals along the top center of the log, allowing the fire to slowly burn downward into the wood.
Just burning the middle out.
Exactly. They had to constantly monitor the burn, applying wet clay or water to the outer edges to prevent the fire from breaching the hull.
Oh, so the clay protects the outside?
Yes. Once a section was deeply charred, they would scrape out the burnt wood with small hand tools and then start the fire again.
Wow.
It was a massive, smoky, blistering labor undertaking for men who were barely clinging to their health.
Before they launch these new canoes, there's this detail in the journals that completely reframes how much trust Watkuwas had built between the two groups.
Oh, the horses.
Yes. The expedition have 38 horses left. These horses are their only ticket home.
Right. They are the only way they're getting back over those frozen Bitterroot Mountains the following spring.
And Lewis brands them with his official iron. And they just leave them with the Nez Perce chiefs.
It is the ultimate diplomatic anchor.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
They are literally leaving their primary mode of transportation in the hands of people they met 2 weeks ago, hoping they'll still be there in the spring.
It's a huge leap of faith.
It's like saying, hey, please guard our only means of survival for 6 months while we paddle to the ocean.
It underscores the profound alliance that was forged. They had to trust the Nez Perce because there was no alternative.
Right.
With their new pine dugouts finished, they hit the water on October 7th. And the environment immediately shifts from the grueling labor of the mountains to a terrifying descent toward the Pacific.
Bringing immense cultural friction along with it.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so picture this. They are moving roughly 2 tons of baggage, instruments, and weapons down the Clearwater, the Snake, and eventually the massive Columbia River.
And this is not a lazy river float.
No. They are navigating dozens of treacherous whitewater rapids.
The physical coordination required to maneuver heavy, newly carved, clunky Ponderosa pine dugouts through whitewater is immense.
Because they're basically just floating logs.
Exactly. These boats are not agile. We are talking about 15 highly dangerous stretches on the Clearwater alone and 9 on the Snake. The hydrodynamics of those rivers require split-second decision-making.
But the major obstacle, the one that really tests their physical limits, is Celilo Falls, which they call the Great Falls of the Columbia.
That's a huge drop.
This isn't just a rapid, it's a 20-foot perpendicular drop, followed by a mile of narrow, rocky churning channels. You obviously can't paddle a wooden log over a 20-foot waterfall, so they have to portage.
And portaging means manually hauling 2 tons of gear and these massive wooden canoes along the northern cliffs.
Which just sounds awful.
They have to enlist the help of local Wishram and Tonino Indians just to manage the weight. It's back-breaking, agonizing work.
And directly below those falls is a section called the Short Narrows, or the Dalles.
Yeah.
When you look at the geographic data for this spot, it is horrifying.
It really is.
The entire volume of the massive Columbia River is suddenly compressed into a rocky basalt chute just 45 yards wide.
It's an insane bottleneck.
Stop and picture that. The cubic feet per second of a major river being forced through a gap less than half the length of a football field.
The term "dal" actually comes from French-Canadian fur traders, referring to the flat, polished slabs of basalt rock that lined the channel, which looked like paving stones.
But the water moving through that compression zone is violently chaotic.
The kinetic energy creates a gauntlet of massive whirlpools, surging swells, and unpredictable undercurrents.
Normally, anyone in their right mind would portage around something this dangerous.
Of course.
But the men are so physically bankrupted from the Celilo Falls portage that hauling those heavy dugout canoes over towering basalt cliffs again is just medically impossible.
Their bodies are done.
So Clark and his principal waterman, a French-Canadian named Pierre Cruzat, make a massive high-stakes gamble. They decide to shoot the rapids directly in these heavy dugouts.
This brings up a fascinating point about risk assessment in extreme environments.
Because they could lose everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're consciously risking the entire expedition, the invaluable journals, the scientific instruments, and their own lives because their muscles simply cannot carry the boats.
It's a terrifying decision born of sheer physical exhaustion.
The local Anishir Sahaptian observers literally line the cliffs to watch them do it.
They are completely astonished.
They probably thought they were watching these strange, pale men commit a very elaborate, highly coordinated group suicide.
Right. But under Cruzat's steering, reading the chaotic hydrodynamics of the whirlpools, they actually make it through.
Which is a testament to Cruzat's phenomenal skill as a riverman. But as they survive the physical gauntlet of the river, they immediately crash into a cultural and linguistic wall that proves just as dangerous.
The language barrier.
Yes. The passage through these rapids marked a significant geopolitical boundary. Beyond the Short Narrows, the Sahaptian language family ended, and the Chinookan language family began.
And this is where their Nez Perce guides, the ones who have been smoothing things over for them, are basically like, well, we can't speak Chinookan, so good luck, we're heading home.
The sudden loss of reliable translators immediately spikes the danger level of the entire expedition.
Up to this point, Communication was the primary tool keeping them out of armed conflict.
Without the Nez Perce, they are forced into a highly complex, agonizingly inefficient translation chain to interact with the local tribes.
It's the ultimate high-stakes game of telephone, and it sounds incredibly frustrating.
It really does.
When you look at how they had to communicate, it's a miracle a war didn't start over a misunderstood gesture.
Right. They had to use Plains Indian Sign Language to communicate with a Sahaptin speaker.
Okay, so sign language first.
Yes, who would then translate that concept into the Sahaptin spoken language,
And then
which would then be translated by a bilingual local into Chinookan.
think about the information degradation that occurs in that chain.
It's massive. By the time a nuanced concept regarding trade valuation or territorial respect goes from English to a physical hand gesture to Sahaptin and finally to Chinookan,
It's just a mess.
the syntax and the cultural nuance are completely dead. You are left with only the most basic, often blunt, transactional concepts.
And blunt doesn't work here because they are trying to communicate with societies that are fundamentally different from the hunter-gatherers they met on the plains.
Exactly.
The riverine Chinookan and Wishram peoples were not isolated. They were highly sophisticated sedentary merchants. They controlled key trade monopolies along the Columbia River.
They lived in permanent wooden plank houses. They controlled the flow of goods between the coast and the interior.
They were businessmen.
Very shrewd businessmen. They were used to haggling with British and American maritime traders who sailed in on massive ships loaded with manufactured goods.
So they knew the market.
They were competitive, and they knew exactly what commodities were worth on the global market.
So here comes Lewis and Clark, rolling down the river in burned-out logs, expecting to just trade a few cheap brass trinkets for vital supplies.
The explorers found themselves completely outmatched commercially. The local merchants demanded high-value items, specifically certain types of blue beads. Yes, which functioned almost as a regional currency. And they demanded them just for basic everyday commodities like firewood.
And to make matters worse, their diet takes another weird, depressing turn here.
Oh, the salmon issue.
Right, the dried salmon that the river tribes offered was often out of season, and frankly, it just gave the explorers that horrible gastrointestinal distress again.
Their bodies couldn't handle it.
So to survive, the explorers started buying dogs to eat.
Yes, they did.
They literally had to haggle for dog meat with their dwindling supply of blue beads.
This intense commercial friction inevitably escalated into severe misunderstandings regarding property and law.
Because they have completely different definitions of theft, right?
Exactly. The river tribes operated under a very different set of cultural norms regarding goods in transit. They regularly left their own bundles of dried salmon unguarded along the river without any fear of theft from their own people.
But when wealthy travelers passed through their territory, taking a small item wasn't seen as a crime. It was viewed as a standard portage toll.
It was a diplomatic way to compel the travelers to show respect, acknowledge the local sovereignty, and engage in trade.
It's like passing through an international toll booth, but neither side realizes what the rules are.
Precisely. The locals see taking an axe or a piece of rope as a legitimate tax on wealthy merchants using their river.
While the Americans, who are deeply rooted in rigid Western legal concepts of private property, see it as lawless robbery.
The captains interpreted these actions as hostile, existential threats to their survival.
This constant vigilance exhausted the men further. They maintained a posture of constant combat readiness, sleeping with their weapons drawn.
And at one point, the tension finally snaps.
Yeah, Meriwether Lewis actually physically strikes a Skiloot Indian who was caught taking an item.
It is a moment where the diplomatic mission nearly devolves into a shootout. You can feel the discipline of the expedition fraying at the edges.
They're exhausted, they're sick, they're eating dogs, and they're constantly on the verge of a firefight over a piece of rope.
But then, in early November, the atmosphere suddenly, dramatically shifts.
They think they finally won the race to the ocean.
On November 7th, 1805, a heavy fog finally lifts on the river, and they see a massive rolling expanse of water stretching to the horizon.
This is one of the most famous, heavily quoted moments of the entire expedition.
Yeah.
William Clark writes in his journal, and you can practically feel the relief radiating off the page. Ocean in view. Oh, the joy.
They did it! They crossed the continent!
The nightmare is over. Or so they think.
What's fascinating here is, When you overlay their journal coordinates with modern geographic analysis, it reveals the absolute cruelty of geography.
Because they weren't at the ocean.
No, they were nowhere near the open Pacific Ocean. They were near Pillar Rock and Grays Bay.
They're just looking at the river.
They were merely looking at the broad, 5-mile-wide estuary of the Columbia River. The actual ocean was still 20 miles to the west, hidden by the curvature of the coastline.
It is a devastating illusion. Because that emotional high, that pure, unadulterated joy of thinking it's over, crumbles instantly.
It does.
What follows is not a celebration on a sunny, sandy beach. It is officially the worst week of the entire trip.
From November 8th to November 15th, they are pinned down at a location that historically earned the name Dismal Niche.
Dismal Niche. Even the name is depressing.
It's located near Megler Point on the northern shore of the estuary, and they are trapped there by relentless, brutal winter gales sweeping in off the Pacific.
I want you to picture the worst camping trip of your life. Now multiply it by 100 and imagine you're wearing rotting leather clothing.
It's just awful conditions.
They're facing severe tidal surges from the estuary, pushing violently back against the river current, creating these massive, chaotic standing waves.
And they are stuck against these sheer, rocky basalt cliffs with absolutely no flat ground to even pitch a proper tent.
And the primary logistical hazard wasn't just the freezing water or the wind, was it?
No, it was the kinetic energy of the debris in the water. The flood tides were tossing around what the journals call monstrous trees. These were massive drift logs, old-growth timber, some measuring up to 200 feet long and 7 feet in diameter, thrashing violently in the surf.
To put the physics of that in perspective, a 200-foot log is roughly the length of a 20-story building.
It's massive.
Now imagine that mass thrashing around in the waves like a giant, chaotic battering ram.
If one of those logs hits their wooden dugout canoes, the canoes are instantly crushed to splinters.
And if they lose the boats, the expedition is stranded on a cliff face to die.
So, to protect their only means of transportation, the men had to exert extreme, agonizing physical effort to drag these incredibly heavy, waterlogged dugout canoes up above the high water line.
And remember, there is no beach at Dismal Niche.
Right.
They are dragging them up a steep, rocky, jagged cliffside. The caloric expenditure is massive, and they have almost no food left to fuel their muscles.
And the rain never, ever stops.
The daily entries describe how their leather clothing literally began to rot and disintegrate off their bodies due to the constant moisture.
Their wool blankets were completely saturated. One journal entry notes that every single man was as wet as water could make them.
Even basic hydration became a severe medical hazard.
Yes. The surrounding river water in the estuary was too brackish. The salinity was too high from the ocean tides to drink safely.
But they are surrounded by torrential rain.
So they are forced to collect and consume raw rainwater pooling on the rocks or on their gear.
But for men whose bodies are already severely depleted, drinking that much raw rainwater acted as a severe purgative.
It caused terrible diarrhea, which only accelerated their dehydration.
It is just misery compounded on misery.
Think about the psychological whiplash. How crushing is it to celebrate the end of a transcontinental journey, to literally document the joy for history?
Only to realize the hardest physical labor and the most degrading, life-threatening conditions are still ahead of you.
Exactly.
It completely strips away all the romanticism of exploration we talked about at the beginning. They are not conquerors standing on a peak here.
No, they're just desperate humans trying to keep their rotting clothes from falling off while dodging giant logs in the freezing rain.
Eventually, after a week of this torture, the weather breaks just enough for them to extract themselves from Dismal Niche and relocate to a temporary camp on a sandy beach on the northern shore, which becomes known as Station Camp.
Which gives them a momentary pause to breathe, but it immediately forces them to confront a massive strategic dilemma.
Right. Where on earth are they going to survive this winter?
It's late November, the weather is clearly awful and only going to get worse. They need to establish a permanent winter camp.
And this leads to a truly fascinating historical moment. Faced with this critical life-or-death decision, the captains take the highly unusual step of polling the entire party on November 24th, 1805.
To decide where to establish their winter quarters.
Now, this event gets talked about a lot in pop history, often framed as a democratic election.
It's romanticized as this beautiful, progressive moment of early American democracy manifesting in the untamed wilderness.
But we really need to deconstruct that myth carefully.
Right, it wasn't exactly a town hall meeting.
Exactly.
If you look closely at military doctrine, historical records suggest this was very much a formal military consultation.
Like a commander asking for input.
Yes. Military commanders operating in extreme isolation often gauge the consensus of their subordinates. The goal is to build solidarity and ensure that whatever grueling, miserable path they choose, the men feel they had a hand in choosing it.
It's a psychological mechanism for maintaining morale and preventing mutiny, rather than a philosophical commitment to the democratic process.
That makes total sense. You want the men to own the misery.
So they give the party three options. Option 1, cross the massive Columbia River and investigate the south side, which is present-day Oregon.
Option 2, turn around and go back upriver inland to the Sandy River.
Or option 3, go even further back upriver to the Great Falls.
The meticulousness of this item is preserved in Clark's ledger. He actually wrote down the individual preferences of the members of the expedition.
And it's fascinating to look at the raw data, including the math.
Yes, Clark compiled the totals at the bottom. He recorded 6 votes for the falls, 10 for the Sandy River, and 12 for Lookout Up, meaning exploring further upriver.
But historians looking at the primary documents point out that Clark actually made a math error in his own ledger.
He did. If you count the individual names he wrote down, there were 6 for the Great Falls, but only 9 votes for the Sandy River and 14 votes to Lookout Up.
It is a minor mistabulation, highly likely a product of severe cognitive exhaustion.
Ultimately, it didn't change the strategic direction. The prevailing logic among the leadership, which heavily swayed the final decision, was to cross the river to the south side.
They had local reports that elk were plentiful there. They knew they desperately needed access to the ocean to manufacture salt, and being on the coast meant they still harbored a slim hope of making contact with a European trading ship.
But what makes this poll truly historic, regardless of Clark's bad math, or whether it was strict democracy or just a smart military strategy, is who was included on that ledger.
I'm talking about the inclusion of York and Sacagawea.
This is where the unique social microcosm of the expedition clashes violently with the rigid, oppressive laws of the United States at the time.
York was an enslaved man, legally owned by William Clark.
Yet, in this ledger, on a desolate beach in 1805, his voice is recorded equally alongside the enlisted white soldiers.
He voted to Lookout Up.
For a brief, fleeting moment, the absolute necessity of wilderness survival flattened the racial hierarchy of the era.
It is a profound, tragic paradox. He gets a completely equal voice to determine the fate of a United States military expedition.
His vote literally counts exactly the same as Sergeant Ordway's.
He's been carrying a gun, hunting, and risking his life equally. But the second they get back to civilization in St. Louis, all of that evaporates.
When York later asks Clark for his freedom as a reward for his immense contributions in equal service, Clark not only denies it, but reportedly beats him and hires him out to a severe master.
There's this brief, shining window of pragmatic equality that just slams shut the moment they don't need him to survive anymore.
Yeah. It is a profound injustice that defines York's legacy, and it highlights how situational that equality was.
And the inclusion of Sacagawea, whom Clark affectionately refers to as Janie in the ledger, is equally complex.
She didn't just cast a generic vote. She specifically expressed her preference to spend the winter in an area with an abundance of potas, or wapato root.
I love this detail. She is basically looking at these military cartographers and saying, look, I don't care about the map. I don't care about the sight lines. I care about the food supply. We need complex carbohydrates, or we are all going to starve to death on a meat-only diet.
And tragically, her warning was largely ignored in the final site selection.
They didn't build the fort in an area directly rich in wapato.
And as a result, they suffered intensely all winter on a diet of lean, spoiled elk meat, forcing them to trade extensively with the local tribes for the very roots she had recommended they settle near in the first place.
But a century later, her recorded participation in this poll at Station Camp became a powerful, mobilizing symbol for the American women's suffrage movement during their campaign for the 19th Amendment.
It's amazing how a pragmatic military consultation on a wet beach gets echoed 100 years later in the fight for voting rights.
But, following the strategic consensus and desperately hoping for elk and a stray trading ship, they crossed the vast mouth of the Columbia River to the south side to build their winter home.
They locate a site about 2 miles up the Nettle River, which is now known as the Lewis and Clark River in present-day Oregon.
Construction on Fort Clatsop begins on December 7, 1805, and they are desperate to get out of the unrelenting rain.
Through sheer physical willpower, they manage to fell the timber and move into the unfinished structure by Christmas Day.
The structural details describe the fort as a 50-foot square compound. It had 2 parallel cabins facing each other.
One cabin had 3 rooms for the enlisted men, and the opposite cabin had the captain's quarters, a room for the Charbonneau family, including Sacagawea and her baby, an orderly room, and a storeroom for meat.
And right down the middle was a central parade ground, secured by heavy gates at either end.
It sounds orderly and secure on paper, but the reality was that Fort Clatsop quickly became what the explorers themselves perceived as a damp prison.
The meteorological statistics during their stay are almost comical in their unrelenting misery. Out of the 106 days they spent at the fort, they experienced exactly 12 days without rain.
12 days out of 106.
And of those 12, only 6 days actually had clear sunshine.
I want you to really try to fathom the psychological weight of that much gray, wet, freezing weather when you were living in a drafty, smoky wooden cabin with 30 other unwatched people.
The perpetual humidity was incredibly destructive to their equipment. It caused their leather clothing and their bedding to literally rot away.
The men were constantly engaged in the tedious, foul-smelling labor of manufacturing new elk-hide garments and sewing hundreds of pairs of moccasins just to replace the gear that was disintegrating off their bodies.
And because everything is constantly wet, dark, and covered in rotting animal hides, the fort becomes an absolute haven for fleas.
Massive, plaguing infestations in their blankets and bedding.
You can't get warm, you can't get dry, and you're being eaten alive by insects while you try to sleep.
Furthermore, because they hadn't prioritized Sacagawea's advice about the Wapato roots, their diet consisted almost entirely of lean, often spoiled elk meat.
In the winter, elk deplete their fat reserves to survive. This means the men were suffering from a metabolic condition called protein poisoning, often referred to as rabbit starvation.
Let's dig into the biology of that. Why is eating unlimited lean meat actually dangerous?
It comes down to how the human liver processes macronutrients. When you consume immense amounts of lean protein without sufficient fats or carbohydrates to balance it, your liver cannot upregulate urea synthesis fast enough to process the excess amino acids.
Ammonia builds up in the bloodstream.
You can eat 10 pounds of lean meat a day, but your body will continue to waste away, experiencing severe diarrhea, nausea, and eventually death, because you lack the lipids and carbs necessary for cellular energy.
So they are constantly full, but biochemically starving to death.
And the health consequences across the board were severe. They suffer from chronic gastrointestinal issues, severe respiratory infections from the damp cold, and we have to mention what the journals politely call Lewy venereus.
Venereal disease was a persistent, debilitating challenge. The men were frequently engaging in liaisons with local women.
The captains had to constantly act as medics, administering their limited, highly questionable medical supplies.
Their primary treatment for syphilis at the time involved mercury-based ointments and pills, which are highly toxic heavy metals in their own right, often causing side effects as bad as the disease.
Yet despite existing in this flea-infested, damp prison, suffering from malnutrition, heavy metal poisoning, and respiratory distress, this winter period is marked by immense scientific and intellectual productivity.
This brings us back to that cognitive compartmentalization we saw with Lewis in the Bitterroots. It is the ultimate defense against despair.
William Clark spends this dark, wet winter meticulously drafting master transcontinental maps of the route they had traversed.
He is synthesizing thousands of miles of geographic data, dead reckoning, and celestial observations by the flickering light of a smoky fire.
It really is astonishing. And meanwhile, Meriwether Lewis compiles extensive ethnographic notes on the local tribes and documents over 30 animal and plant species that were previously unknown to Western science.
And while the captains are engrossed in writing, they dispatch a small detachment, Joseph Field, William Bratton, and George Gibson, about 15 miles south to present-day Seaside, Oregon.
Their mission was vital: to boil seawater.
They set up 5 large metal kettles on the beach and just continuously boiled ocean water for weeks to extract salt.
The mechanics of it were exhausting. You have to keep a massive fire burning constantly in the pouring rain, continually hauling heavy buckets of seawater from the surf, boiling it down, and scraping out the residue.
Salt was a critical necessity for survival. They needed it not just to season their awful, bland, spoiling elk meat, but to preserve whatever meat they could forage for the multi-month return journey.
Through relentless, grueling labor, those men produced approximately 4 bushels of salt.
And while all this industry is happening, the tension with the local tribes is palpable.
When you look at the journals, the relationship they have with the Clatsop, the Chinook, and the Tillamook peoples is fundamentally different from the warm, highly integrated alliances they formed the previous winter at Fort Mandan with the Mandan and Hidatsa.
The dynamic at Fort Clatsop is best characterized as an armed truce. The captains were deeply paranoid and distrustful.
On January 1st, 1806, they institute incredibly strict military security protocols. The fort's gates are locked promptly at sunset. All native visitors are physically cleared from the fort regardless of the weather, and armed sentries are posted every single night.
So what changed? Why were they so paranoid and hostile here on the coast compared to how relaxed they were at Fort Mandan?
It fundamentally comes back to the commercial sophistication of the coastal tribes. The Clatsop and Chinook were not isolated or naive to the value of European goods.
They had spent over a decade interacting with heavily armed British and American maritime fur trading vessels.
They were seasoned, hard-bargaining middlemen in a global, highly competitive maritime fur trade. They knew exactly how much a sea otter pelt, a woven hat, or a basket of rapato was worth on the open market.
So when Lewis and Clark tried to lowball them, offering a few basic fish hooks for a pile of food, the locals essentially just laugh at them.
The historical records note that the Clatsop women actually played a huge dominant role here. They were often the primary business intermediaries, aggressively conducting the trade negotiations with the explorers.
This immense commercial distance, combined with the extreme language barriers and the constant haggling, meant there was very little social warmth.
Unlike Fort Mandan, where there was constant cultural exchange, dancing, storytelling, and visiting inside the lodges, the interactions at Fort Clatsop were almost purely transactional.
On only rare occasions did tribal members enter the fort for non-commercial reasons, like smoking a ceremonial pipe.
So the explorers are isolated, they are sick, they are exhausted, they are tired of haggling over wapato roots at exorbitant prices because they are literally starving on a diet of spoiled elk.
It is a really depressing, claustrophobic end to the outward journey.
They've crossed the continent, they've made all these groundbreaking scientific discoveries, and by March 1806, they are so desperate, miserable, and tired of the rain that they just bounce early. They decide they cannot wait for a trading ship anymore.
The initial strategic plan was likely to stay until April, hoping a European ship might arrive to resupply them with fresh trade goods and medicine.
But dwindling game supplies, the rotting of their clothes, and widespread illness force their hand. On March 23, 1806, the expedition officially vacates Fort Clatsop.
Which leads into the final, morally ambiguous act of this leg of the journey before they begin the trek back east.
They desperately need boats to get back up the massive Columbia River. They officially gift the wooden structure of Fort Clatsop and its remaining furniture to the friendly Clatsop chief Cowboy as a gesture of goodwill.
But then, to actually secure their passage upriver,
They purchase one canoe legally, which isn't nearly enough to carry their men and gear. And out of sheer desperation, unable to afford another boat with their depleted trade goods, they steal a canoe from the local natives.
they steal it. The official representatives of the United States government, the men who have spent a year and a half lecturing the tribes on peace, honor, and strict property rights, commit grand theft canoe.
It is a final act of absolute pragmatic desperation, and it perfectly highlights the strained, exhausted, morally compromised nature of their coastal interactions.
The high-minded ideals of Jeffersonian diplomacy gave way entirely to the raw mathematical arithmetic of survival.
And I think that is the core takeaway for anyone listening to this deep dive. The illusion of the romantic frontier, that clean oil painting of the heroic explorer, is a complete myth.
Survival out there wasn't just about standing on a mountain peak or shooting grizzly bears. It was a miserable, degrading grind.
It was about enduring rotting clothes, eating reconstituted cowhoof soup, managing agonizingly slow translation chains, and relying entirely on the vital, often completely uncredited interventions of people like Watkewise.
The true narrative of exploration is messy and deeply human. It is defined by physiological limits, linguistic barriers, disease, and the constant, humbling reliance on indigenous knowledge and indigenous hospitality.
The Corps of Discovery didn't conquer the West. They barely survived it. And only because the people who already lived there for their own complex geopolitical reasons, allowed them to.
Which leaves you with a lingering, somewhat uncomfortable thought to chew on.
They started this journey as high-minded ambassadors of science and diplomacy, carrying the vision of an expanding nation across the map. But on their final day on the Pacific coast, desperate, starving, and sick of the rain, they literally steal a canoe from the locals just to survive.
It leaves you wondering, when pushed to the absolute limits of physical and psychological endurance, does survival always strip away our highest ideals, leaving only our most pragmatic, ruthless instincts behind?
Or does it just reveal the muddy, compromised reality that was always hiding behind the majestic painting?
A profound question, and one they surely pondered in silence as they started paddling the stolen canoe back against the heavy current.
Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the myths and stay curious as we prepare for the final chapter of their journey back east in Part 4.